Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I know I have a great episode for you today. Dr. Roseann is here with me. We've already had a half-hour conversation that if we could censor it, I might have thrown it out there. But this is going to be a great ride. I'm excited to have her on the show. Way too much expertise for me to even do justice. So Dr. Roseann, please introduce yourself and, talk a little bit about your great works, your books, and I can't wait to dive into some good topics with you.
Yeah, we've already been having too much fun, Matt. So I am Roseann Capanna-Hodge. I am what I like to think of as a mental health trailblazer. And for almost 30 years, I've been working with kids and teens and their families. And I'm on a mission to change the way we view and treat children's mental health. Long before this pandemic, things were not great. And I am somebody who has worked with thousands of kids and their families. And I am a big proponent of using holistic, evidence-based approaches to reducing and reversing mental health. And, at my center, and I work with people remotely, we do everything from neuro and biofeedback to somatic experiencing to EFT tapping to hypnosis. And we do a lot of work with OCD. We do a lot of exposure and response prevention for OCD. And I have a specialty area in Lyme disease and PANS and PANDAS. And, I deal with the biggest issues facing our kids today. I mean, really. And out of this, I have a couple books, one on PANS and PANDAS, another called Teletherapy Toolkit. And it's the first book ever written on teletherapy activities for therapists who work with kids. And then I have another book coming out in April of 2021 called It's Gonna Be Okay. And it gives parents that roadmap on how to reverse mental health. So awesome. I'm here, a woman on a mission to change, mental health and really to teach families and other therapists about how to use holistic therapies, including psychotherapy, which is
wait a minute, that's included?
Forget psychotherapy is holistic.
All right, I know the triggers for both of us, so I'll avoid those to start out. But what of your areas of expertise that I'm really interested in, and one of the reasons why I was excited to have you on is I think a lot of people are really anxious. A lot of us are anxious but really anxious, and I think curious as well about the impact of the pandemic's having on children and youth. And I use the word sometimes chronic trauma to talk about, hey, if you're under this high level of stress for extended periods of time, and I think I not just children, but I'm also worried about a lot of us, especially workers in the field, who have also been exposed to this high level of stress. But I know a lot of us, kids are learning remotely. We know there's huge stress on the families. So with your real focus area on children and youth, what are some things that you are seeing? And if you have any suggestions for folks with kiddos, what are you worried about? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So along with you, if we even talk about, mental health before the pandemic, But certainly now I talk about the same thing. What's the long-term impact of stress, right?
Yeah.
And I, call it the, stress hyperactivation of the nervous system. So our nervous system over time, we have stressors, good and bad. And our body knows no difference between good and bad stress, which is surprising to people, that you could be having great fun times, like being on a book tour and writing 4 books during the pandemic, which Dr. Roseann did, and thinking it was a great idea and having a lot of fun doing it. And now I'm doing 4 launches. Anyway, so it's my nervous system is literally hyper stress activated, and I have to do things above and beyond to take care of myself, including taking a magnesium bath every night, 7 days a week, which sounds great, but sometimes is an inconvenience. But I still do it because I need it, and it's really helps me to sleep.
Yeah.
So, so I know.
I'm not a great sleeper either. So good.
Well, we got to talk about that because you're going to.
I'm 6'7" though. It just doesn't fit in a bathtub. That's my problem.
Oh, well, it can if you get the really big bathtub.
I know. Those aren't.
Your knees can hang out, Matt. Come on. You know what I mean? So, but we're in these stress hyperactivated, situation all the time, and there is a chronic effect. There's always going to be a physical or a mental health issue. There's never a person when you're chronically stress activated. And before the pandemic, kids were very overloaded. A lot of what I see today was there. Lots of anxiety, a real increase in neurodevelopmental disorders. ADD, anxiety, depression are at all-time highs. Suicide rates doubling in the last 10 years for children aged 10 to 17. I mean, hospitals being used as a crisis management system for, mental health for kids too, not just adults. And, we go into the pandemic and we're not exactly in the best mental health shape as families and kids, right? And so what am I seeing today? Like, what are the short term? What is now, as we enter into month 10 of the pandemic, what are the long terms? Like, what is happening? So, on the short term, I think what I'm seeing is a whole lot of overwhelmed parents.
Yeah.
I mean, overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And when our parents are overwhelmed, that's going to trickle down to the kids. Not to make any parents feel any worse than they already do, because we need to be kind to ourselves. And why are they so overwhelmed? Well, they're working from home. They're homeschooling. Who the heck was trained for that?
Right.
And they are short order cooks and entertainment directors and the jail warden of the Wi-Fi system.
Yep.
And I keep passing on to my friends, like, hey, my husband found the best security system to lock your kids out. This is what it is.
Yeah.
I'm like, my 15-year-old still hasn't figured it out yet. So
hey, that's impressive.
It's impressive because he was breaking in everything else.
I'm sure.
So Dr. Rowe's got the same challenges,
Yeah.
I have to say that my family we live a smaller life in that we don't have a giant group of friends, and our kids, one child already was homeschooled and another child goes to a tiny school that only had 8 kids in his group.
Yeah.
So we're not having a huge impact because of the way we live our lifestyle, except that we're not traveling, which is a bummer, but also in some ways it's kind of cool, So, but the short-term impact really is a lot of stress, and I'm seeing kids who maybe had a low level of anxiety or depression before, or ADD. I'm seeing an exacerbation of symptoms. And I'm also seeing kids that maybe never had a problem being identified, really struggling for the first time. And then the third group is I'm seeing kids who maybe they suspected had a problem, or a teacher told a parent, oh, your kid has a problem focusing or getting along with others.
Yeah.
And parents are recognizing it now
Mm.
because you're homeschooling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that we're seeing the same issues in a lot of ways, but we're also seeing these newer issues that have to do with virtual learning. And, virtual learning is not easy.
No. Got a first grade teacher we got a first grade classroom now in our bedroom. So totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And, just like therapists, I don't know any therapists personally that received teletherapy instruction in their graduate program.
Right. No.
Considering that I wrote the first book on teletherapy activities, which is kind of frightening, but people were doing it, and there was a small group of people who were doing it all the time. I think there were lots of people like my practice where the therapists all had one or two clients that they were doing it with. But even within that, I think people weren't, kids and families are not prepared for what virtual learning entailed.
Right.
And teachers, educationally, it's the Wild West out there.
Yeah.
Each district is doing everything different. They didn't get guidance or a framework from the government,
right,
which would have been nice for the teachers.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not saying the whole thing laid out, but it would have been nice. And, I don't even know a lot of districts that really spent time before this school year to really train their teachers on how to do.
Yeah.
I just know a few.
Yeah. And I think it was like, hey, this will get us through maybe the first couple weeks if we need to do this, but it wasn't. Yeah. And
when they returned to school, Matt, though,
yeah.
I mean, we knew this year was going to be like this. And guess what? Next year is going to kind of be like this too. Nobody wants to admit that.
Yeah. I mean, it just like, I think you're right. I mean, there just wasn't the preparation. And I think it pushed a lot of people. I mean, just watching my wife, who it's amazing to hear her across the hall. Like, I'm a pretty dynamic person when I present. So I'm presenting to a bunch of professionals in one room, and we live in a pretty small place. She's just kicking my butt across the hall. I mean, what she does.
That's what kindergarten and first grade teachers do. Otherwise, those motley crew will take you over.
Yes, exactly. Even on Zoom, they will. So, I mean, her school district did a good job, but I don't think, a whole lot of people thought, I think in some ways in the business realm, the transition was, it's like, oh, working at home has a lot of benefits, especially if you don't have kids at home. And it was kind of a fairly, but, watching teachers, like it's a different job. And I think for principals, it became, it was just such a different job that there was it was like starting from scratch. And it was, I think there are lessons learned on how we could do it better in hindsight. But
listen, we're in a crisis.
Yes.
Like you said, I think businesses pivoted and, organizations and thought, let me take care of my employees, right? I think schools thought we can get through this. Teachers can teach in a different way.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that, because we're not really taking into account the impact of mental health on kids and families. And so, I'm seeing a lot of kids and teenagers in particular, teenagers and college kids who are really feeling the emotional effects of isolation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wearing people down.
Yeah.
I've kept myself so busy doing things that when I actually slow down, I'm like, I miss my friends. And my probably my closest friends, they live in other states and countries, and would regularly see them.
Yeah.
Just regularly see them. And, it's just not the same. So I do love the Zoom meeting, and I've been using virtual for a long time. Kids need touch. Kids need connection. Kids need routine. And I think schools are doing the absolute best they possibly can. And I think our teachers are doing an amazing job. I just think that they're missing their students The
Yeah.
kids
Oh,
are
yeah.
missing them. And they're missing a regular schedule and routine. I mean,
Yeah.
you
Do
know,
you see, because you work with a lot of different, for lack of a better word, diagnoses.
yes,
You know, one of the interesting things, because I agree with everything you've said, and then some, with the struggles and the isolation and the mental health issues and the anxiety. I wonder, have you seen this been a good model for any groups that you work with? Because one of the things my wife has seen, and I talked to a lot of people in education in my work. It's like, you know, boy, this is really not healthy. I'm glad we don't do this long term. So it's like, but then there's always, but then
there's
there's
a
this group
subset.
of kids, yeah,
Yeah.
this kid, and like, you know, there's examples of kids who were blowing up classrooms because of behavioral issues. Now they're some of the best students with
Yeah.
this first. So I kind of wonder, from your experience, kind of working across, you know, anxiety, depression, like, have you seen this? Are there any positives you think will bring out of this?
I mean, first of all, I think just in general, I see that families are recalibrating and deciding to prioritize their physical and mental health.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So I don't have a clinical condition that's doing better per se, but I definitely have a profile of kids that are and families that are thriving.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to hear it.
For sure. So I think it's families that got their stuff together. I'm not saying that are perfect.
Yeah.
But they're families that prioritize mental health. They're families that don't expect perfection.
Yeah.
And I think really that, I hate to say this, the moms and dads, even if they're struggling, they're missing their friends, whatever, they are holding it together. They're role modeling how to cope.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think they're, you know, just really doing okay.
Yeah.
And so when the kid is home, they're feeling sort of the calm, they're feeling, you know, like, okay, this is what's going on. And then on top of that, these are always families that have structure and routine.
Yeah.
And it's not just around the academics, it's around physical exercise. I also have a bunch of kids that are doing really well because they're getting like better quality food at home. Now, that's not to say all the kids that are struggling because they're not getting enough food because of poverty, right? But some kids need like a higher level of protein, you know, a hot meal, you know, those kind of things. So it is interesting. And then also I have some kids with chronic health issues that always tried to, you know, maybe they were on a 504 plan or some type of disability plan that allowed them to have a modified school day. So some of these kids are doing really well by going to school twice a week.
Yeah.
Because they're having these 2 long days and they're able to moderate and rest in between.
Yeah.
But I would say that, you know, it is definitely, you know, an interesting time. And I do have a small subset of families that are really using this time to, you know, recalibrate and hence the kids are thriving, you know. I also have a bunch of families that pulled their kids and are now like, hey, we love homeschooling.
Yeah. The numbers here in Colorado about enrollment have just dropped, and some of that's because private schools are staying open. So it's not all that, but it's interesting, these new models coming out of pods and all kinds of stuff. That have been, you know, one of the things that, you know, again, but this is like the families with means seem to have access to these, where the kids that are struggling with poverty, you know, again.
That's so much. Well, you know, it's really interesting. You know, my oldest is homeschooled, and there was several years ago, when my youngest was really little, we exclusively homeschooled for about 4 years. And I'm going to tell you that most of the people were lower income and they were making a sacrifice. And it was also pretty amazing because they would, you know, just like the pods, share, you know, childcare, and you do this lesson and I do that lesson. It spawns a lot of creativity.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really cool things you can do on the cheap when you're homeschooling, and there's a lot of free things available. When you're ill prepared for it and you didn't choose it can get really expensive because you got to hire a babysitter and you got to do this. And, when I was homeschooling, I hired a tutor, and I had a tutor at my house, 4 days a week, 2 hours. I mean, it was just as expensive as a private school.
Yeah.
So, but my kid had medical needs, and that's just what we did. And it was the right thing, and I'm glad to do it. But you're right. There's definitely income disparities that makes a difference in how kids are educated and just having access to things,
Yeah. So what do you think for the educators who might be listening, who get the trauma stuff to some extent, as we survive 2021, we get hopefully the vaccine, and kids, let's say, come back to somewhat a normal situation next school year, which I know is a big question mark in and of itself. But let's be optimistic and say, hey, people take the virus, people behave, we have some normalcy going into the next school year. How would you, with your expertise, what you're really seeing from that mental health perspective, what would you want to put on schools' radars, districts' radars? What do people really need to be thinking about, knowing that kids with maybe, if they were struggling, those struggles will be exacerbated in some way, shape, or form? Probably kids that were maybe doing well, have gone through, difficult times, maybe even something that would traumatize them because maybe, not a huge thing, but just because the length of the stress, parent stress, all this stuff you talked about, it seems like there's a chance to really look at mental health and education, in a different way. What would be some of your suggestions, knowing, for schools to be put on their radar?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think they can expect to have traumatized students. People are dying.
Yeah.
And so that means that these kids are going to have, potentially complex grief, a lot of things, a lot of people, a lot of my adult friends didn't get to properly grieve. I know at our center, 3 of my staff out of 17 people lost a parent. I mean, that's a lot of people. And depending on where you live, in the Northeast, it was extraordinary. And also too, what about parents that are having breakdowns with their kids, right? We already know. I mean, there's just another research studies to make us mothers feel bad on how important our mental health is on our children's mental health for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
So it's preconception, in utero.
Yeah.
I mean,
and then it can go intergenerationally. Yes.
Your cells are in here, everything. So do the best you can.
Yeah.
So how can schools prepare? So I think that they're coping with so much. Mm-hmm. We already know kids are going to be behind educationally. Okay. And parents need to give some wiggle room. I did, the most well-known special education attorney in the United States is one of the nicest human beings in the entire world. His name is Pete Wright. And he
probably not in court, but yeah.
So darn nice, Pete Wright. I love him. Okay. I love him. And he is such a thoughtful man. He's such a leader in advocating for your kids and whatnot. We did this webinar, and thousands of people came to this webinar in the middle of the pandemic at the end of last school year. And people were angry about the kind of education their kids were getting. And there was just all kinds of stuff. I get it. But we're all doing the best we can. Let's try to practice some forgiveness. So I think what educators need to be prepared for is, we know when people are affected emotionally, you're going to get a lot of responses. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing in the pandemic in general is anger and frustration over the pandemic being misdirected at other people.
Yeah. And
I think they can continue to expect that.
Yeah.
I've had it with people yelling at me for no reason. I'm just letting people know. Not that anyone could ever think that they could get away with that with me, but it's kind of ridiculous at this point. why I coined the term reentry panic syndrome, because people were freaking out on me. We're going back to work and they're freaking out.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I think they can expect some level of residual effect. I mean, I think they have to know that and plan for that, right? And I work with schools, private schools, I do consulting, public schools. And so plan for it and make a daily plan to support their students. They have to prioritize mental health, end of story. So what can they do on the cheap? Okay. So 1, we can teach breath work.
Yeah.
We can do meditation. We can do things like calming art activities. We can do yoga. And we can use emotional language. My whole book, Teletherapy Toolkit, has a somatic infusion.
Great.
So every activity teaches you to connect to your body. So we are becoming, as you're a trauma therapist, you already know this, but on the regular, when you're not traumatized, I'm going to tell you that people are disconnected.
Yeah.
Our devices are making us dissociative. We are telling kids to just suck it up and deal with it. They're not connecting to their emotions. And so what's going to happen is we're living this sort of like surreal kind of life right now, Matt, with the world of the pandemic. So I think schools should expect people to be disconnected, and they should really make a plan to support the mental health of their students and anticipate some dysregulation from parents. So having parent workshops, teaching them about that, I think is really important. And also to really, really let parents know, hey, we couldn't be more concerned about your kids' education. But guess what? If your kids are in a high stress state, they're not learning anything.
Yeah.
So let's love them up.
Yeah.
And teach them to love themselves.
Yeah. And I just would love to get your thoughts, because I know that the accepted term is complex trauma, but some friends over in England, UK use compound trauma, which I just think I like that terminology better. And I like it, one, because I can use it in this way. So we got the pandemic, really messed up a lot of things. But in the midst of all this, we've had, I'll admit there were a few times this year I thought our country might devolve into a civil war.
Oh my gosh, totally.
And we've had this, what I think is an amazing, but also stirs up a lot of issues, because systematic racism exists in our educational system. And if you're listening to this, probably your organization as well.
Absolutely.
How do you see those two variables kind of fitting into all this as well? Because one is you come back to school, in some ways, the COVID isolation, there's going to be the psychological, mental angst and anxiety walking in. We're not done kind of with these other, hopefully we're done with the political and we can all get along, but assuming
I hope.
So what do you like all this other stuff too? Because I think schools need to be able to have these conversations about racial justice that are long overdue.
Listen, the best part of what came out of, our racial turmoil, I don't even know what to call it, is the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, in my life, there's so many things that I'm like, wow, like, when I got into mental health, or when I was a young person, I think about the advancement of how we view diversity in terms of sexuality, right?
Yeah.
Where we are today, couldn't even imagine.
No.
Yeah, we are. That's amazing. And the kids, depending on where you live regionally, like where I live, it's like, your kid's like, hey, I'm trans. And the other kids are like, pass the salt,
I know. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing the level of acceptance. And how did that come to be? It was a lot of vocal advocates, a lot of pushing of the boundaries. And I just think, one of my best friends is a Black woman, and I adore her, Dr. Cleopatra. And she is, she's somebody I talk to every day, and is a gift in my life. And it just the conversation of the neurobiology of racism and how you combat it and what you do. And, here I am, a white woman of privilege, and, have Black friends that are like, literally like a sister. And you just realize, I actually could do more. So I love that idea of things. And then really just understanding like like you said, the systemic part of it.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many positive things. We have a long way to go.
Yeah.
So how do they prepare for that? I think when we arc it in mental health, I think when we arc it in, really being kind and respectful to people, which I think is not really a priority in our country, especially in the last 4 years. And but I also think that we have to teach people to take care of themselves and prioritize, their emotions, their social connections, their self-esteem, and not keep prioritizing the grades for our children. Because I think one of the biggest trends, Matt, I've seen in 30 years is that that kids are more and more functional with their anxiety, depression, and OCD. And they are getting better grades because they're being helicoptered and a lot of supports are putting around them, but they're not learning independent skills. And these kids crash and burn. Just an overall lessening of coping skills and resiliency is a major, problem. So I think if schools rise to the challenge to teach families to prioritize these things, and, even in the system, pediatricians talking to parents about this, and, really getting out there and having parents understand, you really raise an independent and emotionally grounded child. Wow. Yeah. You wait and see what they do in the world, because they'll do a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it just, with the marches that I went to, in the spring and summer, just the young people, like, there were a few times I'm like, I don't know. I mean, it's a crowd of 10, 15,000 people downtown Denver. I look at my wife, I'm like, I'm glad I'm not in charge of this. And they just handled it perfectly. Like there's this sophistication, and one of those things that I don't know if you're seeing, in Connecticut where you're from, is there was this moment where the students of the local high schools during the Black Lives Matter movement came together and said, and somehow on one hand, I hate they have to even think about this as a choice of one or the other, but one of the things is like, they didn't want the resource officer in the school any longer. And that, I could definitely see their point of view with that. The interesting thing, though, was what they did ask for, what they were begging for, was more mental health. Now, to choose between, and I know not the resource officer is not a sense of safety for every kid. So I know that this is a kind of a loaded comparison, even just to talk about very shortly, but I was like, they could have chose, hey, we want a bigger football team, or we want new basketball. No, they're begging for mental health. And I think both that kind of cry for help, but also that it was they felt socially safe, where a lot of people in the 40s, my age, still freaking stigmatize their mental health, even though they're in the profession, they won't go see a therapist. I just think it's like schools also have this opportunity the kids are open to this, at least it could be geographically to some extent, but there seems to be an openness to this.
I agree. I think there's a geographic part, like it's almost cool to have a therapist where I live. But
hey, my friend, if we're cool, if the teens want to hang out with us.
No, except our own kids. I have a teenager.
Yeah, oh no.
It's a lot of eye rolling because mom and dad like we think we're so fun.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't think so. And I'm like, but we are.
We are. Trust me.
Mom still goes front row to the concerts. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
You know. So but so I do think there is a destigmatization and kids are much more open about talking about things. I think there's a lot of young celebrities talking about their mental health in such a positive way. And I love that. Like some of our biggest celebrities are really like, hey, I got anxiety and depression and whatnot. When it comes to adults, look at us on social. We are living a fake life.
Yeah.
It is BS.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it really is like, oh, look, they look so great. And then they're divorced next week.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So we're not really being honest. And so I'm grateful that kids today are really understanding it. It's always so interesting, when people bring their kids to me and, my process is different. Everything I do is neuroscience informed. And when somebody does an intake with me, the only way to get in with an intake with me, unless you do an ed consult and I do, virtual coaching in groups, is you have to have a QEEG brain map. And so you're able to see the formation of brain waves. You're able to see exactly what's going on in the brain. There's no guessing. Was this a head injury? Was this PTSD? I had a PTSD client today. And I said, tell me about your emotional traumas. And I said, you also had a head trauma too. And so we had to figure out the head trauma because I go, your head trauma is little. It's your emotional trauma. And so it definitely was some pretty heavy duty emotional trauma. So you're able to see it. And it starts this conversation. But parents often say to me, how am I going to tell my kid they have ADHD or what do I talk about? I'm like, they already know they can't focus.
Right.
You want to give it a name? That's great. But they get so much more hung up on it that the kids I work with, when I'm like, look, here's your brain. I'm making a picture. I'm, making a fist for those of you that are listening. And it's your classic, this is a brain. Then I explain it. And I'm like, here's your frontal lobes. They're the brake, here's your temporal region that has your emotional brain and, all that other stuff. They are literally like, thank you, Dr. Roseann. Thank you. Thank you for explaining this to me. And then I'm like, and there's nothing wrong with you. This is just what you got. This is how we work around it. This is how we optimize it. And they're like, okay, the parents are always so freaked out.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I have to, with the time we got left, I've got to get into teletherapy. Obviously, you've got the book cover, I think, behind you there. So
I do.
You are the expert. I've been really fascinated with the evolution of this. And when I say teletherapy, I just want to put a big shout out to the folks doing case management outreach. Like tons of innovation has been going on with this, both in specifically mental health, but the surrounding social service arena as well.
Oh, they had to redefine everything.
Everything.
Overnight.
And literally some of them overnight had to do this. And I just, I know to ask you in about 20, 25 minutes to sum up your book is unfair, but I just kind of like, obviously you had a book ready to go when this came. So
no, I didn't have a book ready to go. Let me tell you, would you like to, let's start with that.
Let's talk about the story because you talk about getting something out right.
So I call this my Corona creative period.
Yes.
So we closed our center for 10 weeks and I was like, I'm going to write my book, which is, it's going to be okay. That's what I tell every parent because every parent is freaking out when their kid has a problem. I got 2 special needs kids. I understand. And I've been working with families long before I had my own kids. That's how it works, right?
Yeah.
And my kids are going to be more than okay. They're going to be great, right? Plus I'll neurofeedback the bejesus out of them. So my younger one loves biofeedback. So I wrote my book, and just so everybody knows, obviously I'm smart, okay? But I've done hundreds of sessions of neurofeedback and I eat paleo. Okay. Why am I telling you this? Because I wrote 4 books in less than probably about 14 weeks.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
so the first book is like 200 something pages, right? It's my life's work. It teaches you how to reverse mental health. So I wrote that and 2 other books that go with it. And it was June. And I was sitting in my hot tub on my phone, scrolling through, looking for a book on teletherapy activities for my therapist because I was worried. They've been doing teletherapy, but not like me. And I was like, this teletherapy is sticking around because we opened up our center and it was a month later and maybe 20% wanted to be seen in person. And I was like, this is going to keep going. So I'm on Amazon and I was like, there is not a book written.
Yeah.
So this is Wednesday at about a 7 p.m., drinking a glass of wine. By 11 p.m., I wrote the frame. And 31 days later, my 420-page book
impressive.
Is done. So it was like an outpouring, right? Yeah. Now, this book, if you can't see it, but it has a ton of visual components.
Great.
And here's the truth about the visual components. I had 3 interns making the visuals. So I wrote it all, but they made the visuals. And I mean, literally, this book was handed off to them. It must have been like July 20th or something like that. 23rd or something. It was a month later. It was just over. And I had this to print and ready and for sale on October 27th. It was insane. And I'm going to tell you, don't ever do a book launch like that ever again. So
I'm impressed. I published 1 book this year. So you put me to shame.
Well, listen, I put my famous friends to shame. I was no planning to do it or whatever, but I really wanted to have this is called the therapist handbook for treating, children and adolescents. There was nothing there. And, when we finished, we were talking about this. When we finished our graduate programs, right? I don't know about you. I think you had a pretty good mentor, but I was thrown in to working at the largest high school in Connecticut with 47 languages. I don't really get stressed too easily. So I was like, oh, this is great. I can't wait to help so many of these kids or whatever. And I'm only in my late 20s at this point. I'm super cool.
Yeah.
Right. And, always had a cell phone, stuff like that, which was popular, which was not popular yet, right? Pretty cool. It was like texting. They'd be like, are you texting? And I'm like, yeah, like for months, kids, it was So, but we were thrown in without a lot of guidance, which is probably surprising to other professionals because they think, oh, you're a therapist, you've got a graduate degree or whatever. Your early training is highly depending on your mentor.
Yeah.
Right. Well, not Dr. Rowe, because I was like, I don't get what I want. I'm going to find a way. I'm going to go and do the training and do all that. And I always was pushing and pushing and pushing. I was lucky enough that I was in a large district. And so when I found somebody that I liked, I was like, can I come and sit with you? Can I come and do this? Can I come and do that? And, when I left, when I started in a school, I really chose being a solution-focused therapist. And there was a lot of amazing ready-to-use activities that were highly visual.
Yeah.
So when I thought about this, right, these are all activities that are really just redone for teletherapy. So when people buy this book, they get these amazing visuals. There's parent information sheets. It's like literally everything you need to be a teletherapist, like, you name it, challenges, research, everything. But you also, when you buy my book, you can get the PDFs and you can share them visually. You can send them to your clients because, not every client is going to be able to afford to print them out.
Right.
You can pop them up on a screen. There's lots of things, but we know that.
It's like to know you don't have to reach out to the author for the copyright. I just appreciate that as a nerd who consumes consumes books.
You gotta buy the book though for them, you know. But you know, we were thrown into the pandemic, and what I saw with therapists, right? Because I do a lot of training with therapists, is they were panicked, like they just got out of school and they were like, how am I going to do this? I hate this. It's not as effective. This, that. It is as effective. And for those people that are listening, that are working with people, you now know how powerful it can be.
Yeah.
Right? So,
and there again, I would say again, and I can't wait for the hard data to come out around some of this stuff. You know, when I say it seems like a handful of kids in every class might be doing better virtually, I think that's, and you may have given a little language to this as well with the people coming back in. I think a lot of folks, and you know, with you know, a lot of folks I train, people in poverty. So transportation, whether you lived in the country or you lived in the city, was always a barrier. Childcare was always a barrier.
Always a barrier. Childcare was always a barrier.
Yeah. So now I don't have to commute to my therapist, and
right.
An hour appointment becomes a real hassle.
I'm going to tell you, teletherapy is here to stay.
Yeah. I've come to that conclusion as well.
Right. You know, and so there's a lot of things, like people had to do a hard learning curve. Like, again, I use the HIPAA compliant version of Zoom. And I love Zoom because it's so easy. I'm so glad. But like before we did a teletherapy session, it was like, okay, this is what it is.
Yeah.
This is what you do. And now like people are ready to go. They're comfortable. I mean, you know, what's been really awesome in my life, not related to therapy, but I do all this TV, right? Like today a reporter called me and was like, can you get on with me right now? Right now? And I was like, Jasmine, I got a great hair day and a shirt today. I'm be on with you right now.
That's awesome.
You know, it's really funny because that's my party. But in the old days, I had to hop on an airplane. And now in the beginning, all the places, the media places were terrible with stuff. They were trying to do like FaceTime. I'm like, FaceTime, get on Zoom, people.
They couldn't get rid of the delay. Yeah, that's amazing. That's like, how does it, why can I be on Zoom for hours and no delay? And
So anyway, people really have gotten comfortable with technology is the point of my silly stories, but they've gotten really comfortable. It's accessible. You know, we are very niche. Yeah. And so people will come. I have a family that drives 3 hours each way to come to me because of our expertise in PANS and PANDAS and OCD. Yeah. And so they are, you know, now they're able to do some of those appointments virtually and save some time. They still like to come in. Yeah. That's their choice. But you can be in a place, right? You know, Colorado's a pretty big state, and you could be seeing somebody that technically would have been 5 hours. Boom. Yep. You're in over there getting expert care. I love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I want the national certification, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, so let's start with, I want to get to the benefits, but you know, I think, you know, and I'll try not to sound too what we call here in Colorado woo-woo on this, but it just seemed like that there's something that maybe it's just the old school therapist, but there's something about being with another human being I thought it was proximity, and I'm starting to question this, but there seemed to be something very powerful, you know, about the comfort, the compassion that being in a room with somebody creates. And I wonder, I don't know if that's true. You know, in hindsight, I wonder if that's gotten overplayed. But let's just, for the sake of argument, before we go to all the good things about this. Yeah. What are some of the challenges that maybe it's hard to replicate? Do you find anything that's hard to replicate when you were seeing people in person to now?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so first of all, I'm going to tell you it's very interesting. I actually think people let their hair down more in their in-home intakes with me than they do in the office. Yeah. So it seems like I'm actually able to get further when they're on their own turf, which I love, right?
Interesting.
And I go right for it because I have these brain maps and I'm like, here's where it is, people.
Yeah.
Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
I'm like, don't give me every detail of your whole life story because we got the brain and we don't have to take a guess and da-da-da. And they love that. It's so refreshing because so many people come to me with compounded trauma and issues. I know I like compounded so much better. And so there's lots of layers, a lot of medical trauma and whatnot. So what are some things that are harder? So I think one of the biggest challenges, and that's why I wrote this book, is that if you're not on the hustle with kids, you're not up, moving, you're doing physical stuff, you're doing highly visual activities, these kids are going to eat you alive. Mm-hmm. And it is the same in person as it is virtually. And so I think what is happening and what I see when I do supervision with therapists, right, is that they're like, well, you know, we're going to talk about it. Guess what? That's not how kids talk. Kids don't talk. They're not like, I'm feeling very anxious today.
Right.
Okay. Now, my kid will say that because he's had 10 years of indoctrination from Dr. Roseann. But I also did a ton of SE with him, you know, somatic work for his whole life. So he's very connected to how his body feels. And in fact, if he were to say to me, which he has, I'm feeling anxious, I go, show me where it is in your body.
Yeah.
So he understands it. He's in touch with it and whatnot. So I think that's a challenge that therapists have to really present visual things. Yeah. There has to be a higher level interaction. And then they also can't not use the things they were using in person. So we love art in person. We love movement-based things. Yeah. You must still do them. That is how kids, when the body is busy, the mind and the mouth opens up. Yeah. And there's a lot that will come out. And so when we try to do that with kids, I think the other negative that I was seeing, and I'm hoping that it's not the case, is early on in the therapist Facebook groups, is people were like just still spending too much time on joining activities and icebreakers. Yeah. And like, that's not therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
so somatic and you know, I with the body work, and this is the one thing where at least early on I was hearing about it, like things, you know, where maybe the tapping, EMDR, that there were some struggles in that. So what does that, now that you are the expert, I've been dying to ask the expert this question. So much of trauma treatment is somatic. It doesn't look like two people sitting across from each other talking. How have you seen this evolve to take all these things that have been just shown to be incredibly successful? How does that look now in sort of the Zoom environment and telemental health?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like anything else, right? It doesn't matter if it's an adult or a kid. You're in control of the session, right?
Yeah.
In theory, even though their dog may show up there too.
Yeah.
Or their cousin Larry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But lay the boundaries, let them paint the picture of what it's going to look like, right? I think a lot of times in therapy in general, we don't do psychoeducation enough. Yeah. We don't do psychoeducation about their issues, right? Yeah. Can I get it? Can I get it?
You're preaching to the choir on that one.
Right? So, and I spend so much time doing psychoeducation. I know I have this cool thing with the QEEG brain map, but it started with my knuckles and just doing the brain with the knuckles. Yeah. And when you teach people about their brain, they stop feeling like garbage about themselves.
Absolutely. Yes. 100% yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, they start to understand genetics don't define you, that there is an impact on your nervous system. But guess what? There's a lot of amazing things that work to get our nervous system working and our behaviors changing. So I think that, what really has to happen in a therapy session, EFT, we're doing all those things, SE, art, play therapy, ERP, we're doing all that virtually, is that you have to let them know what the session's going to be, right? Yeah. So why do arguments happen? It's mismatched expectations. So therapists get frustrated, clients get frustrated. You have to say, hey, listen, Mrs. Smith, this is what the therapy session's going to be like. I need you to be available. I need you to have your cell phone on. I'm going to call you. You're going to come in the last 10 minutes, not the first 10, because then you're going to take over the session. Just like you would in person. Somehow we think in our office, it's our office and they will do what we want. No, it's a partnership.
Yeah.
And it's a therapeutic bond that creates change. And so it's the same thing. So lay it out, paint the picture. I don't see resistance in the same way. And in fact, what we're really seeing as the majority of our appointments are via teletherapy in terms of psychotherapy is nobody misses an appointment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody does.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's something very motivating about it for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I got one more question because I want to respect your time. And we can always do this again. I think we have many more topics to talk about.
I would love to do that again. We could talk about it.
One shared passion, which might need to be its own episode somewhere down the line. But we also, my measly 200-page book that was my COVID book this year.
Hey, listen, a 50-page book is awesome.
So shamed me this year.
Listen, I'm not going to recommend it. I don't even know where it just poured out of me. I do like writing. I'm not going to lie. Do some neurofeedback, Matt. We'll talk.
Yes. I know. I got some shame to deal with after this podcast. So, and to my great frustration is, I really got a passion for biometrics, or, that we've got all these great ways to measure, like you said, with, looking at brain health as the foundation. And one of the things, one of my passions, both for the affordability of it and the practicality of it and the science behind it, is heart rate variability.
Oh, love HRV.
Yeah. So I you'll appreciate this. I launched this innovative app on March 3rd. Not great timing. But one of the things, I wish that and the timing will make sense somewhere in hindsight when I put a positive reframe on it, is I felt like we had a HRV, for example, a really affordable and good tool. It's sort of like taking vitals from the teletherapy mental health perspective of looking at wellness. And we could have, if we were in the market, maybe even 6 months earlier and got some traction, but really could have helped measure people's mental health. And I wonder, as somebody who uses science and biometrics and neurofeedback, how do you see that playing? Because I think this openness to technology, hey, let me see what your HRV is before readings, or I can track your daily average and, maybe give you feedback over text messages throughout the week. Obviously, we need to set boundaries around that and everything. But I kind of wonder, as also somebody that seems to get excited around where technology is showing us insight, I don't know if we need to fast forward that much, but even if you want to fast forward a little into the future, now that we're getting comfortable with technology, do you see this opening any doors to innovation that's out there in the world?
I do. And going back to psychoeducation, what are biometrics? What is measurement? Not even biometrics. What does measurement do for a patient, a person who's suffering, right? So adults are the worst ones of this, but kids do this too. Most people are spinners. Yeah. They're in their head. They're negative thinkers. They're not able to see that you got to work on that with your therapist, Matt.
I don't know if I spin negative, but boy, do I spin.
Yeah. And when I do a brain map, I can see the brain's communication. I can see the connections. So you can see when somebody's spinning. You can see ruminators. It's pretty cool. Yeah. And then they can't lie. I'm like, oh, so you're a ruminator. Probably like borderline OCD, because you can even see for their like borderline OCD. Wow. Anyway, they're like, holy moly. And then it opens up the conversation. But when we're so focused on negative, and our brain is designed to look for changes and differences. So negative often is something different. Yeah. And so we're wired for these negative thinkers. You have to push yourself. You have to swim upstream. And if you're lucky enough to live in a house like I grew up with, that there were no limits and lots of positive things, you know, I'm like, there's always a solution. What's going on? But when we show people measurement, right? So it can be in my book, I have a SUD scale, subjective units of distress. How simple is that? You can do 0 to 5 or 0 to 10. You know, at the start of your deep breathing, what number are you in terms of your stress? At the end. So using those simple measures, I think is huge. That goes for teachers, that goes for your direct care workers, and that goes for mental health professionals. And I cannot say what a huge deal this is. Yeah. Very powerful. You make a habit out of it. You do pre and post for any type of stress reducing activity. Now, next level, right? So love me my heart math. Heart math, for everybody who doesn't know, syncs your breath with your heart rate. Yeah. And you're using a sensor to measure your pulse, and you're using what's called a pacer. It's a visual to show you when they're synced. Mm-hmm. And that visual helps to entrain your body to get into that rhythm. And why do you get into that rhythm? It reduces, clinically proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and improve sleep. Yeah. So hello, and increase beta, which makes you more focused. So it's a good thing. It's inexpensive. My little one started doing it when he was 2. Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to do. That's how easy it is. When we give people metrics like that, but heart math, I always use temperature dots. Mm-hmm. Okay. So therapists can use temperature dots. Any worker can. You pop it on somebody and you teach them to raise their body temperature and change the color of the dot. Why do you do that? It makes you more relaxed. You go into an alpha state. Yeah. These things are powerful to aid a person to recognize their own capability in changing themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that empowers you. And we know a sense of control helps to reduce anxiety and depression. So I think that's amazing. And what do I think the long term is? There's a lot of little devices popping up. I'd love to hear more about your app. And I think people are much more comfortable with technology. So I think that's really cool. I still think that, being a part of neurofeedback, it's 50 years old. Biofeedback's way older than that. Tens of thousands of research studies. People still say to me, well, why didn't I hear about it? Well, that's a whole other story. But, you can find a certified provider. Actually, the International Biofeedback Society, which certifies providers, is in Colorado. It's bcia.org. Yeah. So find a certified provider and you can get some help. But I think biometrics are amazing. I think they help people on a lot of levels. And even if you're not able to work with a population that can afford these tools, you can still use metrics to help people understand their change. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I was excited about because, my frustration was, well, I also have a heart math reader somewhere buried in the drawer. It was very expensive to do some of this until like some of these readers come out, and now we can get it down to less than $1 a day. And it just like that to me, it's like, oh man, and I tried to get anybody else to do this. I talked to the heart math people. It's like, hey, can you track this over time? And they're not super open to some of the collaborative research stuff. Yeah. So I was like, okay, who can't let a good idea die? So what I got excited about is
hey, we can really take a reading of your nervous system every day for less than $1, for just pennies really a day. And that like level of feedback, both for me as a clinician, but also like for the individual, I don't know which one's more powerful. Like that's one of the things, like, hopefully I get halfway successful with this and universities want to study it. Cause I'd love to have control groups where only the therapist got feedback, the person got feedback, and then there was a both thing.
Yeah.
I think I obviously know which one is more powerful, but I'd love to get that data, because getting feedback on yourself, like I take my heart rate variability reading every morning, tells me how to structure my day. It tells me how much energy and resiliency I have for that day. Doesn't mean I need to get it. I still need to get out of bed and go do my work. But again, it just gives me that I start my day out with a focus on wellness, and I can measure a whole bunch of different activities to see, how it's impacting my stress levels. And, I think that
and
that
it brings such an intentfulness
yes.
and an awareness, I'm definitely a woman in my 40s, and it's an awesome time for me. It's really awesome for me because my friends are finally starting to say no to things, where I learned to always say no to things. Yeah. And so I only do things that I love. Yeah. That's it. End of story. And so I think when we start to understand what our stressors are, we make changes that bring health and happiness into our life. Yeah. And, and so I think that's so, so important. I love the conversations that we're having about stress, but people need to do something, pick it and do it, and do it every day. So I take, like I said, I take care of I right now I'm really into PEMF, which is pulse electromagnetic frequency. I do it every day, 7 days a week. Awesome. But there were periods where I was a junkie with neurofeedback and doing it twice a day. So, I love my equipment. Yeah. I mean, I do. But I also have, done, my longest period of daily meditation was 18 months straight. Mm-hmm. That was a whole other talk about getting your brain to another level of consciousness. Yeah. So there's a lot of things we can do. And, I've actually been refocusing on my breath and really, really making way more of a concerted effort, like not just for 3 breaths, but really taking 10 minutes and really doing just breath work. Yeah. To just rebalance myself, because I wrote 4 books, and no matter how great that is a lot. Yeah. So again, if you're doing a lot of good things, your body's going to be stressed by it. You got to stop, smell the roses, slow down, take care of yourself. It's really important. Beautiful final words for this great episode, Dr. Roseann. Give folks. I'm going to put stuff in show notes about how people can find you, link to your book. But let's say somebody's driving in a car. Give them a web address. Well, you can always find me on drroseann.com. But I have, if you're driving, it's in the show notes. But I have an awesome freebie for your listeners, and it's one of my favorite things that I've done. It's over 100 coping statements that you can use with kids, teens, adults, and they're broken down by different areas. And they're coping statements that I've been teaching kids and families to use for more than a decade. And you can go to teletherapytoolkitbonus.com. That's teletherapytoolkitbonus.com, one word. So it didn't fit in the 400 plus pages? There's no, actually, it's in there. It's in there, but I love it so much that I wanted to give it away. It's one of those things that people print out multiple copies, and they instead of, it's the little things that create big change in mental health. Absolutely. And when we teach kids in particular to cope and with their stress, they learn that they can take control of it and they can feel good about themselves. And they also can process it and not shove it down. Yeah. And when you shove things down, hello, my trauma peeps, it will come back. Yeah. It will show up in some way. and so we want to really create these really resilient kids, and teaching them these coping skills are instrumental. So there are lots of little shifts that we can do, and there are things that even Dr. Rowe pulls out and says for their own kids.
Awesome. Well, I love it. This was a great conversation. Again, traumainformedlens.org. We'll put all the show notes. I expect it to be packed with everything that you've done just this last few months. So it's great to get a new friend. Thank you so much for your passion, your work, and you just consider an open invite. If you ever find yourself with a free hour, please come back.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for always supporting mental health. This was a fun conversation.
Thank you.